Hello and welcome to Week 13 of FINA H101 Art Appreciation. This is presented by Indiana University, Purdue University, Fort Wayne. I'm Dr. Aaron Schwartz, and our topic for this week is art and music, poetry, and ideas. We're going to be talking a lot about symbolism this week. By symbolism, I mean the convention or tradition of investing something with meaning or expressing the invisible or intangible by means of a visible or tangible object or image. So with that in mind, let's move on to our first image. So let's begin our discussion by considering this painting. This is an oil painting on wood dating from between 1425 and 1430. It's a triptych. A triptych is an artwork composed of three elements. It often takes the form of three hinged panels, as what we see here. The central panel of this triptych depicts the Annunciation. That's when the angel Gabriel comes to Mary, who's a virgin, and tells her that she's pregnant and going to have a child, Jesus. Now, there's a lot of symbolism happening in this piece, lots of subtle symbolic elements. And I'd like to encourage you all to do a little bit of research on your own. This is a very famous artwork, so you won't have any trouble finding information on it. You literally just type the artist's name and the title into Google, and you will find all kinds of sources on it. I'd like you to look up on the internet or through other sources if you have them convenient, and consider in your note one example of symbolism being used in this piece. And again, this is super simple to find. So again, symbolism is the convention or tradition of investing something with meaning or expressing the invisible or intangible by means of the visible or tangible. You may find slightly different interpretations of symbols, and this is interesting to note. But let's not try to repeat all the same information here. Finally, you might want to consider in your notes if having all of these little subtle clues makes understanding the artwork easier or more difficult. And this is the core of what I want you to consider as you look at this piece and you do a simple little search and look for the symbolic elements. Do the symbolic elements embedded in this work add something to your appreciation of the painting? And would you have noticed they were there without my prompting you to go look for them? So lots of really neat, subtle symbolic elements. And what we're going to be considering this week in this entire lecture is whether the use of this sort of hidden language, the symbolic language, helps open up the piece to a deeper understanding, or does it make the overall understanding of the piece more obscure? So take a moment to look up this image, pause the video. You will find all kinds of fantastic image details, just doing a very simple search. And consider in your notes how helpful that is to you in understanding this piece. So as we look at these three images, let's consider this concept of a personification. A personification is an embodiment in human form of an abstract idea, such as love, justice, or history, or of a thing, such as a city or a season. All of these statues are personifications of justice. Look carefully, and I want you to consider in your notes what they have in common and how they demonstrate the concept of justice. What are some of the conventions of the concept of justice? Also, you might want to consider why one might want to personify such an abstract idea. The sculpture on the far right is entitled The Contemplation of Justice. It sits outside the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. It portrays a seated woman holding a personification of justice in her hand. That small figure, I know it can be a bit difficult to see, has a blindfold on, which you probably recognize as a characteristic of justice. So I want you to consider, why do you think this artist has depicted justice in this more complex manner than simply showing a statue of Lady Justice as we saw in these other images? So consider this in your notes. What are the conventions of justice being displayed here? Why do we wish to personify such an abstract idea? And what about the contemplation of justice? How is this complicating this idea of a personification? Now we'll move from personifications of justice to a religious scene. This painting by Tintoretto depicts the Christian Holy Trinity, that is, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now you don't need to understand what the Holy Spirit is to try to pick up on this question. But I'd like you to take a moment and try to consider here, even if you're not familiar with this iconography, what do you think represents the Holy Spirit? Why do you think it represents the Holy Spirit in that way? So take a moment, guess how the Holy Spirit is being symbolized here, and then I'll see if I can put an indication on the slide of what it actually is. This painting by Titian is Sacred and Profane Love and dates from 1515. It was commissioned to celebrate a wedding. This is an example of an allegory, which is an expression of a truth of human existence by means of symbolism, often through the symbolic form of a fictional figure. Here, one of the women is believed to represent sacred love, and the other would be profane love. Between them is a little Cupid. Art historians do not agree on which woman is an allegory about which type of love. So I'd like you to take a look at it, and in your notes try to consider what your interpretation is. What do you observe that leads you to your interpretation? Now, to complicate our analysis, might these two figures represent different aspects of love in general, or brides in general? And what do you think the artist intended to make us think? Or did he expect us to understand exactly what he was representing? So again, I'd like you to take a moment to really look at this piece and the details. One of these women is supposedly representing sacred love, the other profane love. You might have an immediate reaction to that, but take a moment to really consider it. So jot down some ideas in your notes, and remember there are a lot of art history scholars who disagree on this point. This painting by the 17th century Dutch master Johannes Vermeer depicts the interior of an artist's studio. Seated at an easel with his back to us is a self-portrait of the artist at work on a painting of the woman posing by the window. The woman's costume contains a number of symbolic elements that identify her as a personification of history. She's holding a book and a trumpet, and she has a laurel wreath on her head. Art historians debate whether this woman is meant to be understood as a model dressed up as history, or the actual muse, which is a type of divine personification, making herself visible to the artist. In either case, the central subject is the artist making a painting of the personification of history. This artwork, however, is not entitled Personification of History, but instead Allegory of Painting. So what does this significant detail tell us about the way Vermeer viewed painting and the role of artists? Jot down your interpretation of this in your notes. So as I mentioned, an allegory is an expression of a truth of human existence by means of symbolism, often through symbolic form of a fictional figure. A personification is an embodiment in human form of an abstract idea, or of a thing. What we're looking at here is Gustave Courbet's The Artist's Studio, a real allegory of a 7-year phase in my artistic and moral life from 1855. So we've seen this image, I think, in an earlier lesson, but now we'll take a look at it in terms of symbolism. First, let's consider the title. If an allegory is that expression of a truth of human existence by means of symbolism, how can it be real? He calls this a real allegory. What do you think Courbet is trying to say when he calls this painting a real allegory? In this painting, seated at the easel, you see the artist himself. This is a self-portrait. He is painting a landscape and surrounded immediately by a nude model, who he is not painting, and a little boy who is looking up in awe at his work. To the right are a group of people who are aristocratic urban people who are educated and sophisticated. Among them are some famous people, including a well-known poet of the time, who happen to also be good friends of Courbet's. To the left, though, are more humble people shown in stereotypes of a village idiot and a drunk. Behind the canvas you see what looks like a sketchy body of Jesus, nude on a cross, and the very back is a landscape. Is this a mural on the wall, or a view out the window? So, what do you think Courbet is trying to tell us about his 7 years? There is a lot going on in this. And again, because of the limitations of this video, this is another image that you might find helpful to look up online, where you can see more detailed details of it. But really take a look at this. What does he mean by a real allegory? And what is he trying to tell us about the last 7 years of his life? Take a moment to consider that. This painting is also an allegory, this time an allegory of music. The central female figure is a personification of sorts, and you can see that she's located in a heavenly environment with 2 cherubs handing her the tools she needs for making music. This kind of dreamy, fanciful scene is an example of Poesia, which is a poetic art that emphasizes the lyrical and the sensual through harmonious, beautiful, and graceful composition. As you look at the style of painting here, how would you describe the visual characteristics or conventions of Poesia? And on a more imaginative note, what do you think the music sounds like that would be played by these characters and in this scene? So consider that in your notes here. This is Kandinsky's Orange from 1923, and it's also a musical work. Kandinsky is believed to have had a harmless condition in which he could appreciate sounds, colors, or words with 2 or more senses simultaneously. For him, certain colors triggered sounds and musical notes in his head. He said that dark blue sounded like a cello to him, and incidentally he was also an accomplished cello player. In his artworks, such as this one, he wanted to translate the symphony of color that he heard in his head to the viewer. So I want you to consider this as we look at his work here. Then, when you look at this painting, describe to yourself in your notes if it's musical to you. Do you hear music, or do you sense music? And if so, what does it sound like? And whether or not you can imagine music while looking at this, what kind of music do you think Kandinsky was trying to share? So consider the musical source and inspiration of this piece. This image is entitled Pastoral Concert, and it's by the artist Titian or Giorgione. We're not sure which. This painting expresses music as well as poetry. The flute held by the female figure on the right and the water poured from the pitcher by the figure on the left would have been recognized as symbolizing poetry during the time of this painting. Now, most scholars agree that these females are meant to be understood as allegorical personifications of music and poetry. The seated men, on the other hand, represent real people. The one is finely dressed in red, probably an illustration of a wealthy, aristocratic gentleman, while the other man on the right, whose leg and bare foot are sticking out just behind the flute-playing woman, comes from a more humble origin. But despite their different backgrounds, the 2 men seem to be getting along fairly well. Now I want you to consider, what do you think is going on in this rather strange scene? What do you think the 2 men are doing, and what is their relationship to the nude female figures? How has Titian, or Giorgione, used symbolism to make a point about music, poetry, and art? And what do you think he was trying to communicate here? Next, we have a piece of conceptual art by the artist Joseph Kosuth called One in Three Tables and created in 1965. Conceptual art is art that emphasizes concepts and ideas over the aesthetic and material value of conventional art objects. This particular piece is also what we would describe as an installation. An installation is an assembly of elements, often of mixed dimensions and form, that transform a designated space in order to express an idea or concept. You can see that this work consists of three elements. So it's essentially a triptych in a format like the Merode altarpiece we saw earlier. There's a photograph of a table, that table itself, which is just an ordinary table you'd buy at a furniture store, and finally on the right there's the dictionary definition of the word table. Now consider this. What do you think Kosuth is trying to say by setting up this comparison? What concept does he want us to think about? And think about the title. How many tables are actually in this piece? Kosuth's work in conceptual art takes significant inspiration from the legacy of Dada, which was an early 20th century anti-art movement that used collage, the randomness of chance, and humor to criticize society and established artistic conventions. Certainly there is an element of humor in the brain-teaser title of Kosuth's work, but do you think there's an implicit criticism here too? Perhaps of society, or of the way we look at images and art. So take a moment and really consider those concepts and what you think Kosuth is trying to say with an installation like this. This is another example of conceptual art and another example of installation. It is also what we would describe as minimalistic art, that is, art which is stripped down to its most basic, fundamental features. This is Sol LeWitt's Variations on Incomplete Open Cubes from about 1974. Here, the artist has demonstrated how many variations are possible with an open cube, which has 6 sides and 12 edges. He removed various pieces until he explored all of the options, getting, for example, the forms you might see on the right. He then installed all of the examples together as you see here. On the wall, he has mathematical details of his process. Now, this is somewhat of a mathematical problem, not only artistic or conceptual. Now, again, I want you to consider, what do you think he's trying to do or say? Do you think a representation of mathematics can still be considered art? What is the relationship between the text, which is the mathematical formula, and the physical objects? Finally, how would you consider the individual components of this installation in terms of our discussion of symbolism? LeWitt has represented mathematical calculations and small-scale models. What do you think these symbolize about the artist, his working process, and conceptual art itself? So this will conclude our lecture for week 13. I know I was asking you to consider a lot of different conceptual ideas and symbolism. Again, I hope that you're able to pause the video where needed and to really think about these ideas and address them in your notes. That will hopefully help you out in your other assignments when thinking about these issues. So as always, I want to thank you very much for your time and participation. Make sure that you're staying up to date on all of our online assignments and so on as we are getting to the home stretch, the last few weeks of the semester. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to email me. My email address, as always, is on the Blackboard website. And if you do need to email me, I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. So once again, thank you very much, and I will talk at you next week.